Episode 11, Part 01, Chapter 11. Chapter 11. Cloud lay back on the bed, staring up at the ceiling of the room he was staying in, within Aris's house. The rest of the house was quiet. Aris and her mom had gone to bed hours before. Still, Cloud couldn't be sure whether they were asleep or not, and so he was thinking quietly to himself to pass the time, until it was possible for him to sneak out of the house without Aris hearing him. While he counted the minutes, he tapped his foot gently against the soft sheets of the bed, fighting the urge to sleep. He wondered what Tifa and the rest of Avalanche would be doing right then. It wasn't incredibly late, so Tifa's bar, the seventh heaven, should still be open by the time he got back. Barrett and the other Avalanche members would probably be in their secret hideout under the bar, planning their next mission without him. Cloud figured that Barrett wouldn't be worried. He never liked Cloud anyway. And Cloud didn't care about him, either. He yawned loudly and closed his eyes. "Seem pretty tired." Cloud jumped violently at the sound of the voice once again inside his mind. "I haven't slept in a bed like this in a long time."
"Oh, yeah,"
Cloud muttered silently. He tried to ignore the annoying voice in his mind, but it wouldn't seem to go away. "Ever since that time."
"My, how you've grown,"
said the female voice.
"I'll bet the girls never leave you alone."
Cloud didn't look up from the bed and continued to stare up at the ceiling. As he lay there, his mother walked around the perimeter of the bed, looking him over with a gentle smile on her fair, slightly old face. She was not as strong as she used to be, but she still seemed as vibrant as ever. Cloud sighed heavily.
"Not really,"
he replied lazily, still refusing to get up. Mrs. Strife looked at him with a flash of concern.
I'm worried about you,"
she admitted. She wiped her hands on her apron and walked right up beside her son.
"There are a lot of temptations in the city. I'd feel a lot better if you just settled down and had a nice girlfriend." "I'm all right,"
Cloud said. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. He then sighed, completely relaxed on the soft, familiar bed. Still his mother wouldn't quit.
"You should have an older girlfriend,"
she said, thinking hard.
"One that'll take care of you. I think that would be the perfect type for you." "I'm not interested."
Cloud suddenly snapped his eyes open, awake, and stared blankly up at the unfamiliar ceiling. He blinked for a few seconds as he tried to remember where he was, before he shook his head and sat up. He was still in Aris's house. As he looked out of the window, he saw that it was fairly dark outside, much darker than it had been when he had closed his eyes.
"I must have fallen asleep,"
he whispered quietly to himself. He stood up and walked towards the door of his room. He paused as he held the handle.
"Sector 7's past Sector 6. I should be all right by myself."
He quietly pulled down on the handle, and it only made a slight squeaking sound. Aris's room was directly next to the spare room, and if he made any loud sounds he would wake her and be caught. So he tried to be as quiet as he could as he shut the bedroom door behind him and began to tread carefully down the stairs towards the front door. The living room was just as quiet as upstairs, and it looked very dark and lonely with the lights off. Elmira, anticipating that Cloud would do as she asked, had left the front door unlocked for him, so he was able to sneak out of the house without being seen, and slipped off into the night. The rest of Sector 5 was just as quiet. All the people were now safely tucked up in their beds, all the shops were shut and locked up tight, and every light was off. It was very silent, and even the pipe with the sick man was quiet. Everybody was asleep apart from Cloud. Quickly but quietly Cloud left Sector 5, leaving the houses and fresh air behind him and back into the dirty paths of the waste yard that surrounded the sectors. He remembered that the Sector 5 church was down one side of the path, so Cloud turned and headed down the other way, to the other path that would most likely lead to Sector 6. He walked briskly, his sword resting on his back, towards the broken wall that bordered Sectors 5 and 6. As he approached the wall, however, he got a shock. Eris was already standing there waiting for him. She had somehow anticipated that Cloud would try to leave without her, and so she had set off early herself in hope of catching him before he left. A strap of rope was resting over her shoulder to hold up a long staff, which was her personal weapon, and which she had quickly picked up before she left. She smiled knowingly as Cloud approached her, with a stunned look on his face.
"You're up bright and early," she said.
Cloud sighed heavily.
"How could I ask you to go along when I knew it would be dangerous?"
he asked her. He neglected to mention the fact that Eris's mother had also asked him to leave without her. But as Elmira had said, it was difficult to make Eris change her mind once it was made up.
"Are you done?"
asked Eris. Cloud scratched the back of his head nervously, his face slightly red. Eris turned towards the hole in the wall border.
"You have to go through the slum in Sector 6 to get to Tifa's 7th heaven. I'll take you there. Come on."
Before Cloud had a chance to stop her, Eris turned and ran through the hole in the wall to the interconnecting paths that joined the two sectors together. Cloud stared for a moment. He finally realized that there was no way he could make Eris change her mind and go back home, so he just shrugged and ran through the wall after her before she could go too far. He soon caught up with Eris on the other side of the wall, and together they walked quickly but carefully through towards Sector 6. The wall they passed through was one of many walls that bordered each of the 8 sectors of Midgar. That was one of the reasons why each of the separate towns within the city became known as sectors, for they were all cut off from each other. Eventually, as Jesse had said, people forgot the names of the separate towns, and the 8 sectors were born. It was difficult at times to move from sector to sector, but it was even more difficult to get out of Midgar. No one could leave Midgar without special permission, and it was just as difficult to get into Midgar. Midgar had become a prison that way, with its inhabitants unable to get in or out. The paths that ran between Sector 5 and Sector 6 was a barren construction yard, which had become the dumping ground for all of the old machines that were no longer used for construction. Wherever Cloud looked he could see large cranes, diggers and trucks. Once they had finished their working lives they had just been left exactly where they were, left to rust and rot. No one had ever bothered to move them, so now they were part of the Sector 5 rubbish yard. The closest anyone had ever come to moving them was to move them closer to the higher walls and paths, so it was possible to clamber to the other side to reach the other sectors. Cloud and Eris had to cross over these at one point, and Cloud helped Eris to climb over the rusting metal of a large digger that had been dumped beside a wall. Once they were safely over they jumped down and headed on towards Sector 6. The first sight Cloud saw of Sector 6 was what looked like an abandoned playground. The giveaway signs were of course the old slides and swings, and even a half-empty sandpit near the entrance. Of course nothing was really usable anymore, and children never came to play, everything was too dangerous. The chains holding the swings were now frail and ready to snap, while the slide looked about ready to crumble and fall apart. Beyond the park was another large wall with a giant metal gate, which sealed off the sectors beyond. Eris stepped up to the broken gate that led into the park. Cloud walked slowly behind her, looking around at the desolate park. It seemed as though everything in Midgar was either dead or dying. Eris stopped a few meters ahead and pointed to the large gate ahead of her.
"The gate to Sector 7's in there," she said.
"Thanks," said Cloud, looking to where he was pointing. He then looked back at Eris.
"I guess this is goodbye. You gonna be alright going home?" "Oh no. Whatever will I do?"
Eris cried in mocking fear. She looked at Cloud's unimpressed face.
"Isn't that what you want me to say?"
Cloud sighed heavily.
"I'll see you home,"
he said. He knew the way now, and could easily make it back on his own.
"Isn't that a little out of the way?"
Eris asked, pointing out the obvious flaw in Cloud's logic. Cloud realized it at the same time as she did. He scratched the back of his head nervously, his face turning slightly red.
"Yeah, I guess so,"
he admitted. Eris smiled knowingly and turned to the park.
"Can we take a break?"
she asked. She walked further into the park and stopped beside the sand pit, with Cloud standing beside her. The young woman gasped as she looked up at the slide. It was built in the shape of half a Muggle's head, with the slide being its tongue.
"I can't believe it's still here,"
she breathed. She suddenly ran forward and disappeared behind the back of the slide. Cloud watched vacantly as he heard some loud rustling from behind the old metal slide, before Eris's body suddenly appeared on the top of the slide from where she had climbed up to reach the playground item she had loved so well. Instead of sliding down the slide however, she simply sat down on the top and waved down to Cloud.
"Cloud, over here,"
she called. The ex-soldier stared at Eris, feeling again that she was in one of her happy, nostalgic moods. He himself had not been on a slide for many years, but he did not get the same urge that Eris apparently did. He shrugged dismissively and headed to the back of the slide to climb up to her. When he was at the top, Eris shifted over to give him room to sit, and together they sat on the top of the slide and looked out at the rest of the deserted park. Neither of them said anything for a few moments, but Eris suddenly looked up at Cloud, trying to speak.
"What rank were you?"
she asked suddenly.
"Rank?" "You know,"
Eris said, pulling her knees up close to her chest and wrapping her arms around them.
"In soldier." "Oh, I was."
Cloud began. He blinked as his head buzzed a little, trying to remember.
"First class."
Eris looked down once more, and gently lay her head on her knees, just as she did on the church roof.
"Just the same as him,"
she whispered quietly. Cloud looked at her.
"The same as who?" "My first boyfriend,"
replied Eris.
"You were serious?" "No,"
Eris admitted. She looked up.
"But I liked him for a while." "I probably knew him,"
said Cloud.
"What was his name?" "It doesn't really matter,"
Eris said, and Cloud again got the feeling that she was trying to avoid the conversation. He looked at her for a few moments more. She looked back at him and gave him a wide, happy smile to show that she was okay. Cloud even smiled a little back. He was about to say something else to Eris when a loud grating noise suddenly pierced through the silence that had spread between them, and Cloud turned to look behind him. The gate leading into Sector 7 had suddenly slid open, and something was emerging from it. It looked like a large and elegant trailer that was being pulled by a chocobo, a bird-like creature that was often used for manual work. There was nothing particularly interesting about the trailer apart from its splendor, and the person that was standing at the back of the trailer, being taken to the next sector. Cloud barely recognized her at first, for she was dressed very differently from what she usually wore. She wore a short blue dress, a very short blue dress to show off as much of her body as she was allowed to. Her long brown hair had been specially styled and she had worn makeup to make herself as attractive as possible.
Hey, back there,"
Cloud said, standing up to look at the trailer more clearly. As he stood, the woman on the back of the trailer looked up and glanced over at Cloud. The two met gazes, and instantly the woman's face lit up with delight and relief. She waved over to Cloud, but she couldn't say anything as the trailer carried her off towards Sector 6.
"Tifa!"
Cloud shouted, but Tifa was already out of earshot before he found the words to speak.
"That girl in the cart was Tifa?"
Eris asked, looking back at Cloud.
"Where was she going? She looked kind of odd."
Eris climbed up to her feet and let herself run quickly down the slide to the ground. When she reached the bottom she brushed off her dress, and then began to run after the trailer towards Sector 6. Cloud looked up in alarm.
"Wait. I'll go on alone,"
he called to her.
"You go home."
He was too late to stop her as well. Eris had already turned the corner to head directly into Sector 6, a sector she herself had admitted was a very dangerous sector. He sighed heavily and shook his head, before he also jumped down off the slide and began to run after Eris. As Cloud finally arrived at the wall market in Sector 6, he could see what Eris had meant when she had called it a rough place. It was a dirty, violent-looking place, with many people walking around. Of course, the people that were walking around were punks with spiked hair, many body piercings and a bad body odor. Many of the punks were walking around head-stoned, vacant faces, and were probably doped up on some kind of herb or drug or something. Luckily Eris had not gone too far into the sector by herself. He spotted her beside the late-night inn, speaking to one of the workers while he sat outside taking a break. As Cloud walked up he saw the worker shake his head, and Eris looked down. She finally spotted Cloud as he walked up to her, and she headed over towards him.
"This place is scary in a lot of ways," she explained. "Especially for a girl. So we've got to find Tifa fast."
So Eris stayed very close to Cloud as they began to wander through the sector, looking for any places that Tifa could be, or at least any sign of the trailer that brought her to the sector. Because Eris was obviously with Cloud, most of the punks stayed well away, or were too drugged up to even notice them. Unfortunately none of the shops they passed by looked like the kind of ones that trailer would stop at. Tifa had been dressed very extravagantly, and the only shops they had seen so far around here were clothes shops, midnight restaurants, and inns. Then again, there was one inn they saw that looked like a likely place for such a trailer to go. The inn was called the Honey Bee Inn, and as they approached they saw the trailer that Tifa had been riding in parked outside, although there was no sign of Tifa. The place was crawling with punks, some wishing they could go in, while others wished they had the courage to go in. The owner of the inn was standing outside, trying to draw in new customers into his inn. As he saw Cloud walking up to him, a large smile appeared on his face and motioned him to come forward.
"Welcome,"
he said cheerfully.
"Even unpopular dweebs, like you may meet your destiny here. You looking for a girlfriend, too?"
Eris glanced around at the other men that were gathered at the inn. At first they had been pretty much unresponsive, but as they saw Eris their eyes lit up with excitement and stared at her dreamily, wondering if she also worked at the inn. She inched a little closer to Cloud.
"You know a girl called Tifa?"
Cloud asked, getting straight to the point. The owner blinked in surprise.
"Hey, you're pretty fast,"
he observed, smiling proudly.
"Tifa is our newest girl. But, unfortunately, she's having an interview right now. Here at the Honey Bee Inn, it's customary for the new girls to be taken to Don Corneo's mansion. Don Corneo's a famous dilettante. Now he wants to settle down and it in the market for a bride."
Despite him saying that Don Corneo was famous, neither Cloud nor Eris had ever heard or. As they headed away from the inn and the hopeful looks of the punks gathered outside the inn, they headed towards the one place in Wall Market that they had not checked, right up in the far north of the sector. Sure enough, Don Corneo's mansion was built there, right at the back of a bunch of stalls. From the looks of the mansion, Don Corneo was probably the richest and most powerful man in Wall Market. Cloud wondered why he didn't move up to the upper plate, for he could obviously afford it. Then he realized that the people in the slums were desperate for money and jobs, and this would be the perfect place to set up his kind of business. He couldn't understand why Tifa would want to come to a place like this, so he knew he had to talk to her and find out. There was a guard standing outside the door of the mansion, another slum citizen that had been hired to guard the entrance to the mansion. He looked up and frowned at Cloud as he walked up, not noticing Eris.
"This is the mansion of Don Corneo, the most powerful man in Wall Market," he growled, curling his lip. "Look, the Don's not into men. So don't let me catch you around here again."
He then saw Eris and stared.
"Hey, and you got another cute one with you."
Eris stared back for a moment, before she had an idea. She grabbed hold of Cloud's arm and pulled him back away from the mansion to a quiet corner where she could talk to him without the guard hearing.
"Hey, this looks like the Don's mansion. I'll go take a look,"
she said and turned away.
"I'll tell Tifa about you."
She headed for the door.
"No. You can't,"
Cloud protested. Eris stopped and walked back to Cloud. She clasped her hands together behind her back and looked at him.
"Why?"
Cloud swallowed nervously. There was a one very big, huge reason why he didn't want her to go in there, but he couldn't bring himself to say it.
"You do know what kind of place this is, don't you?" "Then what am I supposed to do?"
asked Eris.
"You want to go in with me?"
Cloud crossed his arms and turned his head away in thought.
"Well, being a man, that'll be pretty hard. Besides, if I bust in there, it'll cause too much commotion."
Eris watched him for a minute. Suddenly, her eyes lit up as she had another brilliant idea. It was such a terrific and hilarious idea that she had to quickly turn away from Cloud as she began to giggle under her breath.
"But, I can't just let you go in alone,"
Cloud continued to say, not noticing Eris's giggles.
"Oh, man. First, we need to find out if Tifa is alright."
He glanced at Eris.
"What's so funny, Eris?"
Eris turned to Cloud, her face red with giggling. She grabbed his hand again and spurted out her idea.
"Cloud, why don't you dress up like a girl? It's the only way." "What?"
Eris turned to the guard again.
"Just wait. I've got a cute friend I want to bring."
She then turned back to Cloud, who was staring at her in horror, his face bright red just thinking about Eris's suggestion.
"Eris. I can't." "You are worried about Tifa, aren't you?"
Eris asked him. Cloud nodded.
"Then come on, hurry."
She turned and ran off back into Wall Market with much energy and enthusiasm. Cloud just stood frozen to the spot and watched her go. Then he sighed heavily and began to walk slowly back into Wall Market after Eris, wondering what on earth he had gotten himself into. End of chapter. Episode 12, Part 01, Chapter 12. Chapter 12. Eris led the way through Wall Market, dragging an unwilling Cloud along by his hand towards one of the late-night clothes shops where she could get him a suitable dress that could trick the guard and get him into Don Corneo's mansion. She had to drag Cloud along because he wouldn't move otherwise, for he absolutely hated the idea of having to dress up as a girl to get into the mansion. He knew there was no other way, but that didn't mean he had to like it. Luckily, the clothes shop was still open despite the time, and Eris dragged Cloud inside despite his desperate protests. She released Cloud's hand as she walked in boldly, and went right up to the till, wasting no time in getting to the point.
"Excuse me,"
she said cheerfully to the girl behind the counter.
"I'd like to get a dress."
The girl looked up at Eris with a look of regret.
It might take a little time,"
she said apologetically.
"Will that be all right?"
Eris tilted her head.
"What's the problem?"
The shop girl looked down.
"Well, my father, the owner, has been in a slump lately," she explained. "You see, he makes all the dresses." "And where is your father?" "He's probably plastered at the bar," she replied.
There was a sad look on her face, and Eris figured this was something she had probably had to deal with for a while now.
"So?"
Eris said cheerfully, as usual.
"You're saying we can't get a dress unless we do something about your father?"
The girl nodded.
"Yes, I'm sorry. He's caused so much trouble."
Her eyes suddenly opened wide as she realized what Eris was saying, and she stared at her in surprise and hope.
"You would help me bring him back?" "Well, if we don't do something, we don't get a dress, right?"
Eris said simply. The shop girl's eyes lit up in delight, and clasped her hands together in joy.
"Really?"
she asked, still unable to believe her ears.
"Please help my crazy old dad. I just don't know what to do anymore."
Eris nodded.
"All right, we'll do something."
She turned towards the door.
"Let's go, Cloud."
Cloud stood there with his jaw half open, unable to get a word in edgeways while Eris made the quick decision to help the shop assistant's father. Eris marched off confidently out of the shop in search of the pub. He glanced at the shop girl's hopeful face and then sighed heavily. He had no choice but to follow Eris, so he slowly shuffled out of the door and back into the streets of Wall Market. Outside, Eris was waving for him to follow her, for she knew roughly where the pub was. Cloud dragged his feet as he followed her, for he was really not happy with what Eris was planning. Eris on the other hand, was quite enthusiastic, and didn't seem to mind that Cloud's dignity was on the line for Tifa. The Wall Market pub was near the north part of the sector, not too far from Don Corneo's mansion. It looked like a rather rough place and not the most hygienic of places, but then again, neither were the rest of the slums beneath the upper plates of Midgar. As Eris and Cloud walked in, they were hit with the strong scent of alcohol and other strange smells, but they didn't want to know what those were. Surprisingly, there were only a few people in the pub that night, but none of them looked like they were old enough to be running a clothes store. For a few moments they looked around blankly, until Eris pointed over to the corner of the bar near the door. A single, middle-aged man was sat there, slumped in his chair as he held a half-finished drink in his hands. He looked depressed, which was either natural or because of the amount of alcohol he had consumed. He also looked fairly drunk. However, he was the only likely candidate in the entire bar, so Eris and Cloud walked silently over to him. They stopped behind him, and Eris gave him a gentle pat on the shoulder.
"Excuse us," she said as politely as she could. "Are you the father of the girl at the clothing store?"
The man didn't look up at first, and simply took another large swig of his drink. Eris was about to speak again when he suddenly slammed the glass furiously onto the table, and ominously swerved round in his chair to face the two. Eris and Cloud both jumped back nervously, slightly anxious by the sudden aggressive manner of the man.
"I own the clothes shop,"
he said. His words were slurred and slightly uncontrolled, for he was very drunk.
"But I ain't your father."
Eris blinked blankly. Clear he was very, very drunk.
"I didn't say that,"
she replied, but Cloud quickly butted in.
"Make me some clothes," he said.
The owner of the clothes shop turned and glanced at Cloud. He looked him blankly up and down, and slowly curled his lip in disgust. He looked like he was ready to pounce, but was too drunk to be bothered getting up.
"I don't make men's clothes,"
he replied curtly.
"And I don't feel like making anything right now."
Eris turned to Cloud.
Cloud, you wait over there for a second, she said, pointing behind them. I'll try and talk to him. Why don't you got over there and have something to drink?
Cloud stared at her for a minute, but then turned and walked away from Eris and the clothes shop owner. He walked a few feet away and sat down at a table with a half-empty glass of drink on it. He tapped his foot against the floor as he waited for Eris to finish talking to the man, and crossed his arms. Once he was completely out of earshot and looking away from them, Eris turned back to the clothes shop owner, and spoke as gently and as reasonably as she could.
You know, mister, she said softly. He always said that just once, he'd like to dress up like a girl. So, that's why I wanted a cute dress for him.
This caught the shop owner's attention. He raised an eyebrow and took a fleeting glance at Cloud, who was busy drinking from the glass that had been left at the table. He was most surprised when he looked at Cloud's build, for he was fairly strong, and certainly not the type who looked like they wanted to dress up as a girl.
What?
He asked in surprise.
A tough-looking guy like that?
Eris nodded.
So, how about it?
She asked.
Will you make him one?
The owner looked at Cloud once more. He leaned back in his chair as he thought for a moment, and rubbed his chin. Eris watched him hopefully, and was relieved as a small smile spread across his face.
Might be interesting,
he admitted, his curiosity piqued.
I was getting a little bored just making regular clothes. Then you'll do it for us?
Asked Eris. The owner nodded.
Yeah, all right. What kind of dress you want?
Eris folded her arms and thought for a moment, trying to get the perfect picture in her head.
Something that feels soft. And something that shimmers. Got it,
the owner said, nodding his head again.
You know, I got a friend that has the same taste as him. I'll go talk to him.
He then turned back to his drink and finished it off in one large swig, and then got up and walked out of the pub towards his shop again to work on the dress. Once he was gone, Eris jumped up and clapped her hands in delight, and skipped over to Cloud with a large smile on her face.
Will he do it?
Asked Cloud. Eris nodded.
Yes, she said. Let's head over there and watch it being done.
Cloud swallowed nervously, now really uncomfortable with the idea. But he nodded, and so he and Eris left the pub and headed back towards the clothes shop. As they entered, they saw the owner standing behind the counter once more, just finishing serving another customer. The girl was now beside the clothes rack with a happy smile on her face, extremely relieved that her father was back in the shop with her with renewed motivation. As the two entered, the owner looked and smiled at them.
Oh, you're here,
he said, sounding surprised.
It's ready. Go try it on.
Cloud just stared, amazed at how quickly the dress had been prepared. He swallowed nervously, feeling slightly anxious now that the moment of truth had come. The shop assistant took the dress off a nearby rack and handed it to him. It was a long purple dress with long sleeves, made of purple silk and shimmering in the light of the bulb that lit up the shop. Cloud sighed heavily and shook his head, before taking the dress and walking into the single cube changing room at the end of the shop. Changing into the shop proved to be a harder task than Cloud had thought it would be. Being a man, he had never had to change into a dress before, and really had no idea how to put it on.
How do you put this on?
He asked. Outside of the cubicle, Eris had been leaning against the counter while she waited for Cloud to change. She then pushed herself away from the counter and went to the cubicle, peeking through the curtains to see.
Whoa! What are you doing?
Came Cloud's voice on the other side. Eris looked for a few moments more before pulling back.
It's still not right,
she said. She turned away and thought for a moment. Then she clicked her fingers.
A wig. That's what you need.
The owner stepped down from the counter and walked to her.
I thought you might, so I talked to my friend about getting one. You know the gym? You'll find a lot of people there like you. Go and talk to them.
The cubicle curtain twitched and Cloud came out, with the dress back on its hanger. As he heard the owner's words, he looked at Eris with a severe look on his face.
Like you?
He repeated.
Eris, what did you tell him? Does it matter?
Eris asked evasively, shaking her head.
Anyhow, we got a pretty dress.
And before Cloud could question her any further, Eris had already run off out of the door of the clothes shop, heading back up to where the pub was with Cloud in hot pursuit. The gym was on the opposite side of the market where the pub was, and from the moment they entered, Cloud immediately felt nervous. The first thing that hit them as they entered the pub was the stench of sweat. The gym was filled with many men who were working out, all of whom were very strong-looking, with strong muscles and broad, wide builds. Standing in the middle of the gym was a woman, but was not actually a woman. It was in fact a man who had dressed up as a woman, by his own choice. He was small and quite slender, but also looked quite strong, with a brown wig covering his real hair. He looked surprisingly good as a woman, but it still made Cloud feel nervous. She looked up at Cloud and Eris as they approached, and especially looked at Cloud.
You the one who wants to be cute?
He asked. Cloud raised an eyebrow.
Cute?
He looked at Eris, who simply smiled and looked at the man/woman.
Right,
she said.
And about the wig?
He nodded.
Yeah, I heard. But it'll cost you. Erg.
Came a growl behind him. Cloud and Eris looked up as a large, shirtless black man finished punching a bag at the back of the gym and turned to them. He stretched his large muscles and then jumped over towards the two, sweat still pouring over him from his rigid workout.
Big bro.
He growled fiercely.
The only way you're gonna get cuter is if you can beat Big Bro.
Up in the wrestling ring, two twin blonde men stopped their wrestle and also jumped over towards Cloud and Eris. They looked just as strong as the other guy, and Cloud and Eris figured they were both the same, in many ways.
That's right.
One of the two men said. The other blonde man stretched his muscles.
So, you've got to compete with us.
The cross-dressed man known as Big Bro turned and nodded.
You're right,
he said.
Let's do squats.
The first blonde man grinned.
All right. We'll beat you out of this gym.
Cloud blinked and stared at Big Bro.
Are you?
He began.
The beautiful bro.
Eris finished.
What? You didn't know?
The black man asked in disbelief.
Always running around saying Big Bro this, Big Bro that.
Big Bro shook his head.
Never mind that, come over here.
Cloud stepped forward, along with the black man.
Now, I'll explain the rules,
said Big Bro.
You have to do full squats. From the ready position, to squat, and back to the ready position. Got it?
Cloud nodded.
Got it. Whoever has the most squats after 30 seconds gets the wig,
Big Bro finished. The black guy shook his fists fiercely at Cloud.
I'm not going to lose. Big Bro's wig is mine. Just be quiet,
Big Bro said, sighing heavily. He looked at Cloud.
It's not fair for you to start right away. So, you want some practice?
Cloud looked at his challenger. The black guy was of a very strong build and probably of a very high endurance, and could probably squat for a long time without getting tired. However, Cloud knew that if he practiced first it would probably tire him out and he would be weaker during the real test, giving the black guy the advantage.
Don't need to practice,
he said. Big Bro nodded.
Now, let's begin the real thing,
he said. He looked down at his wristwatch and raised his hand.
Start.
At the same time, Cloud and the black man began to squat in the middle of the gym floor. Everyone else in the gym stopped to watch as the two bent their knees into a full squat, and then using their arms to help them go back up smoothly before beginning to squat once more. Big Bro stood beside them, counting the number of squats while at the same time keeping an eye on the time. Eris watched with excitement as Cloud squatted up and down, urging him on as he slowly began to pull ahead of his opponent. Eventually Big Bro glanced down at his watch one last time and lowered his hand to signal the end of the match. Cloud and the black man both stopped squatting and looked over at him, awaiting their results. Big Bro smiled.
He had 15 squats and you had 18 squats,
he replied, and Eris jumped for joy.
You're really something. Okay, I'm a man of my word, here you are.
He walked to Cloud and handed him a blonde wig. It looked quite authentic and was split into two even pigtails. The wig even seemed to be exactly the same shade as Cloud's own hair, so there was no worry about it clashing with his skin. Cloud took the wig and looked down at it blankly, while the black man stood shaking his large fists angrily.
Big Bro, I'm so mad,
he growled.
I'm so mad.
Big Bro turned ominously and walked towards the black man while he stood there cursing loudly over his loss. Big Bro stopped in front of him and paused for a second, before he reached up and gave the man an almighty punch across his face. The black man went flying across the gym floor and landed with a loud thud at the other end of the gym, where he slumped instantly to the floor in a weak and helpless heap. Big Bro was stronger than he looked, despite being smaller than the others.
Shut up!
Big Bro ordered him crossly.
Don't cry just because you lost.
The black man tried to stand up, but he fell back onto the floor, still winded.
Uff,
he groaned.
Bro's fists of steel cut to the bone.
While Big Bro and the two blonde twins went over to see if their friend was alright, Eris and Cloud quickly headed out of the gym and back towards the clothes shop. Throughout the time they were walking, Cloud just kept turning the wig round and round in his hands and slowly shaking his head. Eris walked beside him with a large smile on her face, glad now that they had all that they needed to make Cloud into a girl. She did have the idea of getting other accessories for him, perfume, jewelry, even lingerie, but she figured Cloud would just draw the line at that. Which was a pity. As they entered the clothes shop, the owner turned to them from behind the till and nodded.
Looks like you're all set. Now try it on, and we'll see how it fits.
Cloud hesitated again for a second, still unsure about whether him dressing up as a girl was a good idea, and extremely worried about what Eris had said to the owner to get him to agree in the first place. Eris noticed his hesitation and turned to him.
Aren't you going to change?
She asked. Cloud took a deep breath and sighed.
Okay. I'm ready,
he said. He then walked into the changing room, and everyone waited to see the result. End of chapter. Episode 13, Part 01, Chapter 13. Chapter 13. Finally, the curtain of the changing room twitched and Cloud came out. Everyone in the shop stopped and gasped at the result, for it was a very good transformation, and if they didn't know any better, they would have been convinced that Cloud was in fact a girl. Despite his strong build, the dress that Cloud wore managed to cover up pretty most of his muscles, and left him looking quite delicate and feminine. The dress ran all the way down to his feet, leaving only a small part of his boots visible so he could walk easily. The wig also managed to cover up most of his hair apart from the odd blonde spike, but the overall effect was quite good and very convincing. The owner looked at Cloud up and down, rather impressed by the transformation.
Not bad,
he said.
This may be a new business for me.
His daughter nodded in agreement.
Yeah, you're right. Should we try it?
She suggested. She turned to Eris and Cloud, the weary and desperate smile now gone from her face and replaced with a smile of happiness.
Thanks for showing us something new. My father's got his motivation back now. So the dress is on the house.
Eris turned to Cloud.
Walk more nicely like this, Miss Cloud,
said Eris, and walked delicately across the floor of the clothes shop. Cloud just stared.
What do you mean nicely?
He asked her. He also then walked across the shop, his movements slightly altered because of the dress. Eris watched him for a moment, and figured that his walk was okay enough to be convincing. She clasped her hands together tightly, unable to contain her excitement.
Oh, you're so cute, Miss Cloud,
she said teasingly, amused by Cloud's glare.
Ah, I want one. Do you have one that'll look good on me too?
All at once the owner and his daughter began to choose some beautiful dresses from their long racks, choosing the ones they thought would suit Eris best. Unfortunately their ideas were clashing.
How's this? How about that one? Father, what are you talking about? This one's much better. No, what are you saying? This one.
Eris then walked towards the clothes rail, directly between the shop owner and his daughter. She reached out and picked one particular dress that caught her eye.
I want this one,
she said. She pulled the dress off the rail and placed it over her to see how it looked. It was a long red silk dress with a slim shape, and shimmered in the light. Eris seemed quite pleased with it, while the shop owner and his daughter just stared in amazement.
Hey!
They gasped, astounded. Eris turned, holding the dress.
I'm going to change,
she said plainly, and walked towards the changing room to change into the dress she had chosen. Before she walked in, however, she stopped and turned back to the people in the shop.
No peeking,
she warned them, and then entered the changing room. A minute or so later, she emerged from the changing room wearing the dress, her original clothing in a bag that she could carry around with her. She had untied the pink ribbon that bound the ends of her plait together, letting her thick brown hair spread out across her back, long and wavy. As she came out, she twirled in the dress elegantly.
So? How do I look?
She asked excitedly, looking to Cloud for her answer. Cloud stared vacantly for a moment or two, unsure of how he should reply to Ares's question. In the end, he looked down at the ground and shook his head pitifully, sighing heavily. Ares looked at him and put her hands on her hips indignantly.
Oh, you're no fun.
She told him. Once everything was ready, Cloud and Ares stepped out into the streets of Wall Market and headed towards Don Corneo's mansion. Cloud stared uncomfortably as he felt the gazes of many men looking over him and Ares dreamily, but stopped advancing as they saw Cloud's angry glare looking back at them. Ares, of course, seemed to like the attention that he was receiving, for she was very proud of her creation. Cloud was not at all comfortable with the attention, for he found it quite scary to think that he made quite a convincing girl. It was convincing enough for the guard outside Don Corneo's mansion at least. As Cloud and Ares walked towards him, his eyes lit up tremendously, looking them both up and down dreamily. He was especially interested in Cloud, much to his dismay.
Damn! Your friend's hot, too!
He exclaimed. Cloud put his hands together nervously.
Come in, come in!
He turned and knocked loudly on the door of the mansion.
Two ladies coming through.
There was a pause before the large doors of the mansion opened up in front of them. The guard moved aside and motioned for Cloud and Ares to go through into the mansion. The two girls did and walked into the mansion, bowing gently to the guard politely as they went past and into Don Corneo's mansion. The inside of the mansion was just as they expected it to be, considering the kind of place it was. It was very elaborately decorated, with red carpets covering the floors and smooth wood on the stairs. There was a desk for people to make appointments on the ground floor, while upstairs there were the more private rooms. There was one small door at the top of the stairs, while at the other end of the balcony there was a doorway with no door, probably leading down into some kind of wine cellar. The largest door was in the middle of the upper level, and was a set of double doors that were intricately patterned. No doubt that was the room of Don Corneo himself, and most likely contained his private chambers. As the two entered, an assistant walked out of a back room behind the desk, and grinned as he saw Cloud and Ares standing in front of him, waiting.
Hey, ladies,
he said cheerfully and cunningly. Cloud and Ares turned to him and walked up to the desk. The assistant looked at them for a moment, seeming satisfied.
I'll go and let the Don know you're here. Wait here. Don't go wandering around.
He turned and headed off into the back room, going to tell the Don that there were two more ladies waiting to see him. Once he was out of view, Ares turned to Cloud.
Now's our chance,
she said to him.
Let's find Tifa.
Cloud nodded, and together he and Ares began to search the mansion for Tifa. The hall was the only room downstairs, so they headed upstairs to search. The smaller room was locked, and there was no way they were going to enter Don Corneo's personal chamber, so that left only one place to search. Cloud led the way to the final doorway and headed down the old stone steps. The last room was not a wine cellar as he expected, but rather another private room, and clearly for the use of those with their own personal tastes. Right in the center of the room there was an altar of sorts, with handcuffs positioned in places where the wrists and ankles would go. Cloud felt a little sick as he saw it, for he was getting a better image of what Don Corneo was like, and he didn't like it at all. As he reached the bottom of the steps, he saw a figure at the other end of the room, standing with her back to him. It was Tifa. She turned and looked at Cloud, who stopped and looked back at her. Cloud then turned away and quickly ran back towards the stairs, slightly embarrassed to be near Tifa in the condition he was in, even though it was clear that Tifa did not recognize him as he was. Ares then came down the stairs and saw the two separate from another. She glanced at Cloud, who had lowered his head to the ground in his awkwardness, and then looked at Tifa. She headed over to the woman.
Tifa?
She asked, just to be sure. Tifa nodded and walked over to Ares, who smiled gladly.
Nice to meet you. I'm Ares. Cloud's told me a lot about you.
Tifa tilted her head and looked at Ares closely, puzzled.
And you are?
She asked. She then blinked as she realized where she had seen Ares before.
Hey, you're the one with Cloud in the park.
Ares nodded.
Right, with Cloud. Oh.
Tifa muttered quietly, and turned away from Ares.
Don't worry,
Ares added quickly, shaking her head.
We just met. It's nothing.
Tifa turned back sharply.
What do you mean, don't worry? About what?
She asked, obviously trying to be evasive to the point that Eris was making.
No, don't misunderstand. Cloud and I grew up together. Nothing more.
Eris giggled joyfully, and Tifa again tilted her head, confused as to what Eris found funny.
Poor Cloud,
said Eris through her humorous giggles.
Having to stand here and listen to both of us call him nothing.
She turned knowingly and put her hands behind her back.
Right, Cloud.
Tifa turned to where Eris was looking, and looked at what she saw was just another girl standing shyly at the other end of the room with her back to them. She stared as the girl slowly turned her head to glance at them, before turning away again.
Embarrassed?
asked Eris, still suppressing her giggles.
Come on, speak up.
Finally Cloud sighed and turned, walking with his head down and stopping in front of Tifa. The girl leaned over to look at his face more closely, for she just saw him as another girl. But as she looked into his face she could see his familiar features, and his glowing blue eyes. She immediately jumped back in complete surprise and amazement.
Cloud!
She exclaimed loudly. She then began to speak fast in her desperation to get all her words out in one go.
Why are you dressed like that? And what are you doing here? Forget that, what happened to you after the fall? Are you hurt?
Cloud shook his head calmly, finally finding the courage to speak to Tifa.
Hey, give me a chance to answer,
he said to her. He sighed.
I'm dressed like this because there was no other way to get in here. I'm all right. Eris helped me out.
This caught Tifa's attention.
Oh, Eris did?
She said, sounding sad and disappointed once more. Before she could say anything else, it was Cloud's turn to ask a question.
Tifa, explain,
he asked her.
What are you doing in a place like this?
Tifa turned back and scratched her head nervously, feeling a little caught out.
Yeah,
she stammered, unsure of how to put her predicament to Cloud. She looked down so Cloud couldn't see her face, although he was sure she had gone red.
Ahem.
Eris coughed loudly. Cloud and Tifa both looked at her while she smiled.
I'll just plug my ears,
she added. So she walked away from Cloud and Tifa and stopped at the other end of the room, where she placed her palms firmly over her ears so she could not hear anything, since she could sense that this was going to be a private conversation. Once she was out of earshot, Tifa smiled with relief.
I'm glad you're okay,
she said truthfully. Cloud smiled a little and nodded his head.
Thanks,
he replied.
What happened?
Tifa nodded.
When we got back from the number 5 reactor, there was this weird man,
she explained to him.
So Barrett caught him and squeezed some information out of him. That's when the Don's name popped up,
Cloud presumed, feeling certain that Tifa meant it literally when she said Barrett squeezed some information out of the weird man prowling around Sector 7.
Right,
said Tifa.
Don Corneo. Barrett told me to leave the Lek alone. But something's been bothering me.
Cloud nodded.
I see. So you wanted to get the story straight from Corneo's mouth?
He presumed, piecing together the rest of Tifa's story, which was self-explanatory. Tifa nodded, but she still looked a little concerned.
So I made it here, but now I'm in a bind,
she told Cloud. She began to rub her hands together anxiously as she spoke.
Corneo is looking for a bride. Every day he gets 3 girls, chooses one of them, and then... well...
She began to stutter nervously, not wanting to say it. She finally shook her head.
Anyway, I have to be the girl or I'm out for tonight.
Eris looked up.
Sorry.
She apologized.
But I overheard.
In actual truth, she had been listening to the conversation the whole time, turning and peeking occasionally while the two spoke, but she didn't want them to know that. She walked back to Cloud and Tifa.
If you know the 3 girls, then there's no problem, right? I guess so, but...
Tifa said hesitantly.
We have 2 here, right? No, Eris.
Cloud exclaimed suddenly. Eris looked at him.
I can't have you get involved.
Eris indignantly put her hands on her hips and glared at Cloud.
Oh.
She asked him shrewdly.
So it's all right for Tifa to be in danger?
That caught Cloud out.
No, I don't want Tifa in.
He stammered, scratching the back of his head nervously. Tifa looked at Eris, trying to piece together what kind of person she was. Eris looked quite delicate and feminine, but from the way she spoke and the things she said made Tifa think that there was more to Eris than meets the eye. Even though she seemed open and trusting, there was an air of mystery around her that Tifa could sense, but she seemed all right. She walked over to Eris while Cloud struggled to find an answer to Eris's remarks.
Is it all right?
She asked Eris. She and Eris both walked slowly towards the stairs and out of Cloud's earshot, to make their conversation a little more private. Tifa wanted Eris's personal opinion.
I grew up in the slums,
said Eris.
I'm used to danger.
She turned to Tifa and looked at her closely.
Do you trust me?
Yes, Tifa replied without any hesitation.
Thanks, Ms. Ares.
Eris smiled.
Call me Eris.
Tifa smiled as well. Even though this was the first time she had ever met Eris, she had seen enough of her to know that she could trust her. Cloud also seemed to trust her, even if he was a little hesitant to let her get involved in affairs that were of no concern to her. That didn't seem to stop Eris at all, for she would have gone along even if Cloud and Tifa had told her to go home where she was safe.
Why?
Came an angry voice from upstairs. Everyone in the cellar turned and looked at the top of the stairs to where Corneo's assistant was standing and glaring down at them.
It's time, ladies. The dawn is waiting.
He turned and began to walk off, muttering loudly.
I told you not to wander around. I tell ya, women nowadays. Hurry up, will ya?
Cloud walked up to Tifa and Eris nervously.
I probably don't need to ask,
he said.
But the other girl is... me. Right.
Tifa and Eris both looked at each other with knowing smiles on their faces. Tifa nodded.
You're right, there was no need.
Eris nodded.
To ask.
Cloud sagged heavily, already fearing the worst. It was all right for Tifa and Eris to an extent, they were women and could easily extract the information they wanted from Corneo. He, on the other hand, was a man, and if Don Corneo chose him that night he would be put in a very difficult position. He tried to be more positive, thinking that with Tifa and Eris both beside him there was only a 1 in 3 chance that Corneo would choose him. The three headed back upstairs and saw the assistant standing by the entrance to Don Corneo's chamber. He grinned slyly as they walked up, and pointed to the closed door.
The Don's waiting in his room,
the assistant said, his grin wide on his face.
Ha ha ha.
The door opened in front of them, and Cloud and the two girls walked into Don Corneo's chamber. The inside of Corneo's personal chamber was just as they had expected it to be. Expensive items lined the walls and the floor was lined in a thick red carpet. At the far end of the room there was a desk covered in papers, with 2 hired guards standing on either side. Like everyone else in the mansion, the hired guards were merely punks, inhabitants of the slums who had luckily managed to get a job working for Corneo. Don Corneo himself was sat at his desk, sat back in his throne-like chair patiently as he waited for the 3 girls to enter. Just from looking at him it was possible to see why he had not yet found a decent bride. He was not very attractive, and clearly had a very high opinion of himself. He was bald and fat, with a long red robe covering his bulbous body, and a crown on his empty, shiny head. For the moment he had his eyes closed as though awaiting something. Cloud, Tifa, and Eris all entered the chamber nervously, unsure of what to expect. They looked around as they entered, wondering what they should do. They got their answer as Kaj, one of Corneo's hired slum guards who was also just a random punk pulled in from the streets, stepped forward and waved his hand to the 3. As they looked at him he motioned to the rug in the middle of the room in front of the desk.
All right, ladies,
he said. He sounded excited himself as he looked the 3 over.
Line up in front of the Don.
The 3 did as they were told and lined up on the rug in front of Don, with Cloud standing in the middle and right in front of Don Corneo. Once they were all stood silent, Don Corneo finally opened his eyes and gazed upon the 3 girls. All of a sudden he leaped up out of his chair and landed on his desk, his eyes bright and dancing as he looked the 3 over hungrily.
Good, splendid,
he said, his eyes darting from one to the other as he looked them over. He clambered over his desk and began to give the 3 a closer inspection. He first inspected Eris, looking closely at her face and eyes, and Cloud could almost see his mind racing with ideas just from a first glance.
Now, let's see,
Corneo muttered to himself as he looked Eris over.
Which girl should I choose?
He then walked over to Cloud and began to examine him more closely. As he leaned in for a closer look at Cloud's face, Cloud quickly turned his head away a little, half closing his eyes so Corneo could not see his glowing Mako eyes, for that would give the game away completely.
This one?
He wondered aloud. He blinked a little as Cloud turned his head away, but didn't seem to mind. He then went to Tifa and began to examine her closely.
Or this one?
Having examined all of the three girls, Corneo went back to Cloud, curious by Cloud's shyness. He leaned into Cloud's face again, but Cloud quickly turned his head the other way to deny Corneo a closer look. Corneo tried to look at the other side, determined to get a look, but Cloud again turned his head away. It was comical to watch Cloud continuously turn his head again and again, trying to avoid Corneo's hungry glare. Finally Don Corneo jumped, his mind made up.
Hoo-hoo.
He cheered merrily.
I've made up my mind. My choice for tonight it.
He paused for a moment to raise the suspense, before he held his arms open to Cloud.
This healthy-looking girl.
Cloud stepped back, completely horrified.
Wait a sec.
He protested, before he realized what he was doing.
I mean, please wait a moment.
Corneo clapped his hands excitedly, pleased at Cloud's reaction.
Woohoo! I love chickies who play hard to get,
he said.
Yoza.
He turned towards his two guards by his desk.
You can have the other ones.
Koch and the other guard both saluted gladly at Corneo.
Yes, sir.
They cheered.
Thank you, sir.
Corneo grinned and looked back at Cloud, who was still petrified.
Well then, shall we go, my pretty?
Cloud turned his head and glanced at Eris. Eris looked back at him and nodded her head, but from the smile on her face it looked as though she was trying to stop herself from laughing. When Cloud turned his head and looked at Tifa he saw that she was trying hard not to laugh as well, but she also nodded her head to advise Cloud to go with Corneo. Cloud sighed heavily and began to follow Don Corneo towards his bedchamber at the back of the room, leaving Tifa and Eris at the hungry hands of the guards. End of chapter. Episode 14, Part 01, Chapter 14. Chapter 14. Corneo jumped excitedly at the top of his bed, looking thrilled to be with the company of what he thought was a beautiful blonde girl. He was rearing to go and seemed very keen on Cloud, not suspecting for a minute that the girl he had chosen was actually a man. Cloud stood nervously at the far end of the room, as far away from the bed as possible and growing increasingly uncomfortable with the situation. He had never thought for 1 minute that Corneo would have chosen him for that night, and Cloud didn't know how to act. He knew he had to extract the required information from him, but there were only two ways he could do that. One would be to reveal himself and demand the information at sword point, but then he could call his guards and Cloud would be caught. Or he could do the more sickening idea, flatter Corneo and build up his ego, until he was ready to tell Cloud anything that he asked. Neither way was particularly inviting, but the second was the only option that would leave Cloud physically intact, even if his pride was not.
Ah, we're finally alone,
Corneo said dreamily as he ogled Cloud from across the room. Cloud looked away from him, not wanting to meet his hungry gaze.
All right, pussycat. Come to daddy.
Cloud turned pale with nausea and refused to look at Corneo. Corneo was sick, really sick, and made Cloud completely sick to his stomach. He couldn't believe Tifa and Eris had forced him into this situation, and would like to kill them once this was all over.
Woohoo!
Corneo cheered again. He crawled over his bed to get a little closer to Cloud.
Don't be shy. We're all alone now.
Cloud still refused to look at Corneo, thinking that because they were alone was why he was nervous. Corneo was a very sick-minded person, and Cloud didn't feel very safe being in the same room as him. He tried to remind himself that he did have a job to do here, and whether he was going to get paid extra from Barrett or Tifa or not, he still had to keep up the pretense. So he plucked up all of his courage and slowly walked round the side of the bed towards Corneo, trying to keep at a safe distance so Corneo couldn't grab him. Although Corneo was too smitten then to notice how Cloud was edging away from him.
You're so cute, I never get tired of looking at you,
he said to Cloud. He leaned in a little closer.
Do you like me, too?
It occurred to Cloud to say no, but he still remembered that he had to get information from him about what he had to do with the man in Sector 7. He didn't particularly want to flatter Corneo, but he could tell it was the only way to get information from him.
Of course.
Cloud replied, raising his voice a little so he sounded more feminine. He felt like a complete idiot having to do so, but the more information he could get from Corneo, the better. It seemed to work though, for the grin that spread on Corneo's face seemed to be very happy and excited. As Corneo grinned happily, Cloud felt increasingly uncomfortable.
You sure do know how to make a guy feel good.
Corneo exclaimed. He moved on the bed again, and leaned in even closer to Cloud, almost seeming nervous.
Then, what do you want to do?
Run was what Cloud wanted to do, or at least push Corneo away from him. He knew the perfect line that would really inflate Corneo's ego, but he didn't want to say it. He swallowed hard.
Whatever you want, Daddy.
He went pale as soon as he said it, feeling completely sick and humiliated. He wished he had his sword with him so he could just force the information from Corneo, but unfortunately Eris had it right then from when he had changed.
Oh, man!
Corneo shouted. He jumped up on the bed, unable to contain his excitement and eagerness anymore.
I can't stand it. All right, then. Give me a kiss. A kiss.
Cloud shook his head.
Nope, can't do that.
He replied. Corneo fell onto the edge of the bed, staring at Cloud in dismay.
Why? Why? Why?
He asked. Slowly Cloud turned away, and took a few steps away from Corneo.
Because I'm gonna have to use that mouth of yours to give me some information.
With that Cloud jumped up and spun round, unable to stand Corneo's cheesy lines and advances any further, and he was not prepared to go any further than this. He pulled the dress off and threw it harshly onto the floor along with the cheesy blonde wig, finally revealing his true identity. Corneo's eyes opened wide and he leaped back into the corner on his bed, finally realizing that the girl he had chosen was not really a girl, but rather a man.
A man!
He shouted in horror. He narrowed his eyes and glared at Cloud angrily.
You tricked me! Somebody get in here now! Unfortunately, no one will be coming to help,
came a female voice. Cloud and Corneo turned as the door to the bedroom opened and Tifa and Eris both ran in, back in their normal outfits. Corneo's guards had taken them, but it was nothing to them to fight them off and come to help Cloud. Eris was carrying Cloud's sword, and as they entered she and Tifa both threw it to Cloud. Cloud caught it easily and held it firmly in his hand. Corneo saw the length and width of the blade and shrunk back in his bed, looking from Cloud to the two girls, completely horrified and confused.
You're the ones from before!
He yelled, speaking to Eris and Tifa.
What the hell's going on?
Shut up! Tifa ordered harshly.
We're asking the questions now.
She and her crew all gathered around the side of Corneo's bed, cornering him into the corner of his own bedchamber. Corneo flinched back and shrunk into the corner, afraid of the three who had trapped him. Tifa stood firmly with her hands on her hips, glaring at Corneo.
What did your assistants find out?
Tifa asked of Corneo, who shook his head.
Talk. If you don't tell us.
She glanced at Cloud. Cloud nodded and stepped up to the bed. Sinisterly he put on foot on the bed and rested his arm on his knee, looking at Corneo in such a way that made him feel very uncomfortable. Cloud then grinned slyly.
I'll chop them off,
he said, finishing Tifa's threat. Corneo stared and blinked for a moment, a little too dense to grasp what he meant. Then his jaw hung open, and his eyes fell onto Cloud's monstrously long sword with its razor-sharp blade. He jumped up in fear, shaking his head vigorously.
No. Not that.
He pleaded fearfully.
So? Talk,
said Tifa. Corneo nearly shook his head again, but then remembered the length of Cloud's sword. He stuttered nervously as he spoke.
I made em find out where the man with the gun arm was,
he stammered, his whole body shaking.
But that's what I was ordered to do.
Tifa tilted her head.
By who? No.
Corneo yelled, his face pale and shivering.
If I told you that, I'd be killed. Talk.
Demanded Tifa.
If you don't tell us.
She glanced at Eris, who did the same as Cloud and leaned forward menacingly on the end of Corneo's bed.
I'll rip them off,
Eris finished. Again Corneo jumped back, feeling more afraid than ever.
Why?
He wailed. He pressed himself against the wall in his desperation, but there was nowhere for him to go.
It was Heidegger of Shinra. Heidegger, the head of public safety maintenance. The head of public safety maintenance.
Cloud exclaimed.
Did you say the Shinra?
Tifa roared, snarling at the name. She glowered at Corneo, her brown eyes raging.
What are they up to? Talk. If you don't tell us.
She joined Cloud and Eris in their dominating stance on the bed, and grinned evilly.
I'll smash them.
Don Corneo swallowed hard and looked into the determined faces of the three standing in front of him. Their expressions were set and steady, without a single flicker of humor or doubt in them. He could tell that they meant every word of their threats.
You're serious, aren't you?
He said. The expressions of the three didn't change, and Corneo struggled to swallow the lump in his throat.
Oh boy, oh boy, oh boy.
He took a deep breath and looked up at the three.
I'm not fooling around here either, you know,
he added.
Shinra's trying to crush a small rebel group called Avalanche and want to infiltrate their hideout. And they're going to crush them. Literally. By breaking the support holding up the plate above them.
Tifa jerked violently.
Break the support.
She cried.
You know what's going to happen?
Asked Corneo, relaxing a little.
The plate will go ping and everything's gonna go bam. I heard their hideouts in the Sector 7 slums. I'm just glad it's not here in Sector 6.
Tifa stepped back away from the bed, one hand over her mouth in shock as she found herself unable to believe what she was hearing. She knew that Shinra was ruthless, they had let another of their reactors explode just to get rid of Avalanche, but she never thought for one moment that they would go even further and kill dozens of people, just to get rid of them. And it wasn't just the people in the slums who would be killed, it would be the people on top of the plate as well. So many people would die at Shinra's hands. Tifa shook her head in disbelief.
They're going to wipe out the Sector 7 slums,
she exclaimed. She turned to Cloud, her face desperate.
Cloud, will you come with me to Sector 7?
Cloud nodded.
Of course, Tifa.
Tifa smiled with relief. She looked at Eris, who also nodded. The three then headed for the door to head for Sector 7, but as they began to leave Corneo jumped up on his bed.
Just a second.
He called. Cloud stopped and turned back to him.
Shut up. No, wait, it'll only take a second,
Corneo insisted. Cloud looked at Eris and Tifa. He then sighed and looked back at Corneo, his hands on his hips as he waited for Corneo's next lame speech.
How do you think scum like me feels when they babble on about the truth?
Corneo asked. Cloud tilted his head at the question.
They're pretty much given up on life,
he replied. Corneo grinned.
Buzz. Wrong.
He shouted. He reached out and pulled on a lever propped up beside his bed. As he did, a large hatch suddenly opened up in the floor beneath Cloud's feet, revealing a gaping hole in the floor. With nothing holding him up, he fell down into the darkness, quickly followed by Eris and Tifa, who screamed as they fell. Once they had disappeared, Corneo stood up on his bed and began to dance to himself, celebrating his victory over them. Up in Shinra headquarters, Heidegger, the head of public safety maintenance, was busy making his way leisurely towards the president's office at the top of the building. He was fairly large but strong and not flabby, and was dressed in a smart green suit. His face was large and rough, with a thick beard and heavy eyebrows. He had a cold and cruel expression on his face, giving the impression that he, like many of the people who worked for Shinra, was not a particularly caring person. As he walked into President Shinra's office, he saw the president sat behind his large desk at the far end of the room, waiting patiently for Heidegger to arrive. At the other end of the desk and looking edgy was Reeve, another Shinra employee. Reeve was different to Heidegger in that he had a less cruel expression, and looked uncomfortably and nervous, although Heidegger ignored this.
How are the preparations going?
President Shinra asked as Heidegger walked into the office and towards the desk.
Ha, ha, ha.
Heidegger laughed, his voice deep and coarse.
Smoothly, very smoothly. I assigned the Turks to this. President!
Reeve exclaimed, looking at the president with a flash of anxiety. President Shinra looked back at him.
Are we really going to do this? Simply destroy a group with only a few members.
President Shinra narrowed his eyes.
What's the problem, Reeve? You want out?
He got up out of his chair and began to walk round towards Reeve and Heidegger. Reeve turned away from the desk, seeming hesitant.
No,
he answered finally. He looked up.
But, as head of the Urban Development Department, I have been involved in the building and running of Midgar. That's why. Reeve, you should flush those personal problems in the morning.
Heidegger advised him sarcastically. Reeve turned and glared at Heidegger, clearly disliking him.
The mayor's against this anyway.
Reeve added pitifully. In response, Heidegger turned away and shrugged.
Mayor,
he repeated, his voice filled with disgust.
He just sits in this building all day feeding his face. You call that a mayor?
He turned and saluted President Shinra.
Now if you'll excuse me, sir.
Heidegger then turned away and laughed as he walked out of the office. Reeve began to run after him in protest, but stopped as Heidegger disappeared out of the door. He stared blankly for a few moments, until President Shinra walked up to him.
You're tired,
the president said to him.
Why don't you take a couple of days off and go somewhere?
Reeve looked at the president in surprise and blinked. The president looked back at him with a stern and steady expression. Then, seeing that he wasn't going to get anywhere arguing with the president, he walked out, leaving the president alone in his office. President Shinra walked forward.
We'll destroy Sector 7 and report that Avalanche did it. Then we'll send in the rescue operation care of Shinra Inc. Ha, ha, ha. This is perfect.
Deep in the sewers that ran beneath Midgar, a hatch opened up in the ceiling. Moments later, Cloud, Tifa and Eris appeared and fell down towards the sewer, landing with heavy thuds on the damp concrete ground. Cloud groaned as a sharp pain ran up his back, coming from where his sword had landed on him after the fall. He could hear the sound of running water in the background, as well as feel small traces of it beneath him and running through his hands. When he opened his eyes, he saw Tifa lying near him, her back to him as she lay still for a few moments. Cloud slowly climbed to his feet, his sword falling to the ground behind him as it rolled off his back, and crawled to Tifa.
You all right?
He asked her. The young woman blinked and turned her head to look up at him. She gladly took Cloud's hand as he offered it to her, and Cloud pulled her up to her feet. Once she was standing, she began to brush off all the damp dirt that had stuck to her skin and clothes.
Man! This is terrible!
She exclaimed, and ran her fingers through her hair. Eris was also on the ground a few meters away after she had rolled across the ground, and Cloud went to her. He slipped one hand under her head and helped her to sit up.
You all right?
He asked. Slowly Eris nodded.
Yeah,
she replied, standing up and also brushing herself off. Her staff was lying on the ground beside her, and she picked it up and began to remove the gunk that had fallen on it.
Well, the worst is over,
she said. As she spoke, a loud roar echoed through the tunnel, and the ground shook. Eris shrugged.
Maybe not,
she added. Another loud roar rang throughout the sewer, reverberating off the walls around them. Soon there came the sound of heavy footsteps, followed by the sound of something dragging heavily across the floor. With each step the sounds became louder, and the ground shook more violently as they grew closer. The group of three looked to the corner ahead of them, which turned off into another sewer tunnel. As they watched, something began to emerge from the corner, climbing up over the rails and across the walls towards them. It was a sewer monster, another monster that had been born and grown in the sewers of Midgar. It was incredibly large and heavy, with sickly green, blue skin that was patterned with many other colors that were probably caused by mutation. The Mako that leaked from the reactors had probably caused this mutation, and also corrupted the rest of the monster. Its arms were large and bulky, and so long that they dragged across the floor when it walked, hence the shuffling sounds. Its body was almost square-shaped, with its muscles flat but bulky. Its head was also roughly square-shaped, with a mouth full of razor-sharp teeth that were disgustingly yellow from years of neglect. As it crawled around the corner, it jumped down from the path and into the tunnel groove where Cloud, Tifa, and Eris stood, with their weapons at the ready for battle.
Ugh!
Tifa groaned, curling her lip in disgust.
What is that thing?
Cloud raised his sword.
It doesn't matter,
he said.
We need to get to Sector 7. Let's kill it.
Tifa and Eris both looked at him, before slowly nodding their heads and raising their own weapons in preparation for battle. The beast in front of them roared loudly, beating its large arms against its chest. It then began to walk forward towards them. It had very poor eyesight, that was its only weakness, but it had very good hearing and used the sound of their heartbeats in order to guide in the direction of the group. Cloud began the attack first and ran towards the beast. As Cloud began to attack the monster, Tifa turned to Eris. She pulled out one green ball of materia that was attached to her gauntlet and passed it to her, the ice materia that Barrett had previously had. Eris took it gladly and placed it in a materia slot on the side of her staff. They then turned to the monster and ran in to join Cloud in his fight. At that particular moment Cloud was pressed against the wall of the tunnel with the monster looming over him, with his sword raised in front of him to impale the monster if it tried to attack him. The monster stepped forward on its large flat feet towards him, towering above Cloud by a good few feet. He looked down at Cloud through his narrow eyes, twitching his ears and focusing on the faint sounds Cloud didn't even know he was making. The giant beast reached out and swung out with one of its giant arms. Cloud hurriedly dodged out of the way, jumping to his right and rolling to the ground on the other side of the monster. The monster's fist slammed into the concrete wall of the tunnel with such force that the wall broke and shattered, sending large chunks of old concrete flying into the tunnel. Cloud looked up just in time to see a large piece of broken rock falling towards him. He quickly rolled out of the way just as the rock crashed onto the floor where he had been lying a second before, and smaller rocks fell around him. The sound of Ares' scream then caught his ears, and he looked up. Ares and Tifa were both on the other side of the beast, who was now facing them. Now his attention was shifted to their movements. Tifa ran forward to the monster and began to punch it hard with her fists, a series of powerful punches enhanced by the firmness of her gloves. The monster took a step back before swinging his arm again to hit her, but Tifa was very swift and managed to jump back just in time, avoiding the blow. Then it was Ares' turn to attack. She held her staff out in front of her, and the green ball of materia inserted in one of the handles began to glow and shimmer brightly. Ares then released her hold on the staff, and it magically floated in the air in front of her. The woman then raised her arms above her, and glow of the materia intensified. A flash of white appeared in their air around the monster, and a thin blanket of ice began to form around it. For a second or two the monster froze, encased in the ice. Eventually the ice began to crack and burst apart, releasing the monster once more. The monster looked down and shook its body thoroughly, removing the last of the ice shards from its body. It then glared at Ares, catching her movements as she took hold of her staff again. He bared his teeth and swiped his fist at her. He missed Ares purely by a mere centimeter as she jumped back, where she fell against the wall and onto the dirty floor of the sewer. She looked up to see the monster towering over her with a large boulder of concrete in its hands, which it had pulled from the broken wall. The monster threw the boulder down at her, and Ares quickly scrambled to her feet and out of the way. The boulder smashed into the wall and caused the tunnel to shake violently, making Ares fall to the floor once again. The monster lifted his head high and roared angrily, infuriated with the way he kept missing his targets. He hit his chest hard with his fists before rolling them angrily around his head in a circular motion towards Ares and Tifa, who stared back blankly. Cloud stared as well. He then looked up as a faint sound came from behind him, and he slowly turned his head to look behind him. He then opened his eyes wide. A wall of water was beginning to rise up behind him, formed from the sewer water that had previously been lying dormant and untouched. The monster, being a creature that lived in the sewers, was causing the water to rise up into a large tsunami behind them. It rose taller and taller, ready to drop down at any moment.
Tifa! Ares!
Cloud called over the monster.
Get out of the way! Tsunami!
He dashed to the side of the tunnel and jumped up, grabbing the edge of the path above, where he quickly pulled himself up and out of the way. He made it only just in time, for as he reached the top the tsunami toppled over and tumbled into the tunnel, heading straight for the monster, as well as Tifa and Ares. Tifa grabbed hold of Ares as she sat up and pulled her roughly towards a large groove in the wall beside them. The water slammed down and began to sweep into the tunnel, thick and fast, towards the monster as it stood in the middle of the tunnel, roaring loudly. The water hit it from behind and smothered it completely. Tifa and Ares watched fearfully from their groove in the wall as the water flowed past them, sending sprays through the air that fell on them and soaked their hair. For a moment they could only see the dirty green-blue water, but as they watched another flash of darker green-blue zipped past them. The wall of water flowing past them suddenly broke as the sewer beast's hand burst through and grabbed hold of the edge of the groove, desperately trying to hold on. Moments later another hand burst through and grabbed hold of the wall as well, and Ares screamed. She screamed again as the monster's head then appeared, teeth bared, ready to swipe them. Tifa quickly stood up and walked to the monster as it reached for them. She looked at the monster's ugly face, before jumping up and kicking it hard in the face. The kick was enough to make the monster lose his grip. His hands slipped from the wall and disappeared into the water once more, vanishing forever. When the flow of water subsided, Tifa and Ares clambered out of their hideaway, and Cloud jumped down from the path and back into the tunnel. The monster had gone, destroyed in its own water flow. The water level was now back to normal, if not a little dirtier than before, but at least the three were safe. Tifa didn't seem too enthusiastic however.
It's too late,
she said, her voice quiet.
Marlene. Barrett. The people of the slums. Don't give up hope,
Eris told her sternly, taking her hand in her own.
Never give up hope. It's not easy to destroy the pillar, right? Yeah.
Tifa muttered. She thought for a moment, before she lifted her head with a smile on her face.
You're right. We still have time.
With that the group turned and began to head off into the maze of sewers that beneath Midgar, praying with each step that they would make it in time before the plate fell and killed everyone in Sector 7, including Barrett, Marlene and the rest of Avalanche. End of chapter. Episode 15, Part 01, Chapter 15. Chapter 15. Cloud finally managed to push the old, heavy sewer lid out of the way and climbed out of the sewer, relieved to get out of the dark and dreary sewers and back into the slums. The air was not much better, but it was better than the sickening smell that ran through the sewers. Once he was out, he turned to the hole and helped Eris climb out, and then they both helped Tifa out. Once all three of them were out of the sewers and had finished brushing the damp dirt from their clothing, they looked around at where they had come out. They were standing in what looked like a large train yard, for they were surrounded on all sides by many old and abandoned trains. The trains had just been dumped anywhere on the ground and left there, and many were now broken and wrecked, savaged by punks desperate for food or just a place to sleep. It was a barren, empty place, and was like a graveyard for trains. However, it was a good sign, because the train graveyard was directly next to Sector 7, which meant they were very close to the slums, and the plate had not fallen yet.
Eris,
Cloud said suddenly, and Eris turned to look at him. Cloud was looking down at the floor, refusing to meet her gaze.
I got you mixed up in all of this.
Eris quickly shook her head.
Don't tell me to go home,
she told him. Cloud slowly raised his head and looked at Eris's face, finally meeting her gaze. He barely knew her, just as she barely knew him, but she had willingly risked her life for them many times already, and still refused to go home. He knew there was no use arguing with her now. Like Almira had said, once Eris had made up her mind, she wouldn't change it. Eris smiled as she realized that Cloud understood that, and walked past him towards Tifa. Tifa had walked away from them while they were talking, and had climbed up onto the top of a nearby train by a ladder, and was looking around at the rest of the graveyard, trying to find her bearings.
Let's see.
She mumbled quietly to herself. She turned around to look the other way, and stretched up to see over the rest of the trains. She then pointed ahead of her.
If we can just get past the trains that are lit up, we should be able to get out of here.
She jumped down from the train and back beside Cloud and Eris who were waiting for her below. The three then began to walk through the wreckage that was scattered around them, heading north to where they hoped the rest of Sector 7 was. They had to hurry because they had very limited time. At any moment Shinra could succeed in its plans to bring down the plate that was suspended in the air above them, and everyone in the slums and on top of the plate would die. The trains that were lying on the old broken rails had been abandoned for a very long time. When Midgar had first been built and they were in use, they were probably very fashionable, very streamlined trains. Now however, after years of neglect, they were very rusty and fragile. Dark copper rust had formed over the doors and wheels and even on the old rails where they had been pushed out of the way. There was almost no chance of finding a train that would move, so when the group came to a blockage in their path they had to climb up onto the roof of the train and down onto the other side. Some of the trains still had some form of power though, for in some of the trains the lights were still turned on inside, albeit flickering and faint as they strained to stay alive amongst the rest of the graveyard. It was a spooky and desolate place, and the three wanted to get out of there as quickly as possible, not only to save Sector 7 but also leave the creepy graveyard of trains behind them. The group clambered over what they hoped would be the last train in the desolate graveyard, and were extremely relieved to see that it was. As they emerged from the roof of the last train they saw the Sector 7 train station just American Samoa they had left it. The single train was resting quietly by the platform, with the single Shinra guard in front of it, waiting for the next load of passengers. It all seemed very quiet and calm in the sector, clearly no one had any idea of what was about to happen. Cloud, Eris, and Tifa wasted no time in running out of the graveyard and towards the slums. As they ran out of the train station and into the clearing between the station and the slums, they saw that things were more unsettled than they had first thought. In the middle of the clearing was the large stone pillar that rose up right beneath the plate to hold it up and prevent it from falling, sealed off by a large metal fence to prevent anyone from entering. The gate leading into the pillar sector had now been forced open, blown from its hinges by guns. Many people from the slums had gathered around the pillar, looking in and chattering loudly amongst the stairs as they looked up the stairs that wound their way up at the side of the pillar.
We made it!
Tifa exclaimed gladly, running into the clearing.
The pill is still standing. Wait!
Cloud said suddenly, interrupting Tifa's excitement. Tifa looked at him as he tilted his head, listening hard.
You hear something? Above us.
Tifa put a hand behind her ear and looked up to hear what Cloud was hearing. She could hear a faint sound coming from above them. It was a repetitive sound, a sound she recognized only too well, for she had heard it often enough from Barrett.
Gunfire!
Guessed Eris. One by one the three all looked up above them towards the pillar. As their gazes slowly rose up the stairs, they saw many flashes of light and more sounds of gunfire coming from all corners of the pillar. A fierce battle was raging around the pillar. Gunfire and counterfire were being shot as the battle to save the pillar raged, rising all the way up to the top where the main platform was. As the group looked up, they could see a number of moving figures on the top platform. One fairly small figure was slowly backing off towards the edge of the platform, being forced back by more people with guns. He reached the end of the platform and stopped, with nowhere else to go. A gun suddenly fired and the man fell off the end of the platform, and began to tumble down towards the ground. He landed with a loud and heavy thud on the ground in the middle of Cloud, Tifa, and Eris as they stood staring. Everyone moved away from the pillar and gathered around him to see if he was okay, and Tifa screamed in horror as she saw the man who had fallen. It was Wedge.
Wedge!
Cloud yelled.
You all right?
He ran to Wedge's side and kneeled. Wedge was very badly hurt. There were bullet wounds in his side where bullets had skimmed past him, and he was twisted round from his fall. He seemed to react to the sound of Cloud's voice, and slowly opened his eyes to look at him, although his vision was blurred and failing.
Cloud?
He whispered, gasping harshly as pain shot up his back. A small smile spread on his pain-stricken face, relieved to see Cloud was alive.
You remembered? My name. Barrett's up top. Help him. And Cloud. Sorry I wasn't any help.
The pain then became too much for him, and he closed his eyes and passed out. Cloud looked down at Wedge, a look of sympathy across his face. He had spoken very little to Wedge, and any words he did say were short and harsh. Yet to see Wedge lying there after fighting to save the pillar, struck a strong nerve within Cloud, for he was really just an innocent caught up in something much stronger than himself. He shook his head vigorously and stood up harshly, looking at the pillar.
I'm going up,
he announced. Tifa stood up determined beside him. Cloud quickly turned to Eris.
Eris. You look after Wedge.
Eris looked as though she was going to protest, but then stopped and nodded her head. Tifa ran over to her and grabbed Eris's hand firmly in her own.
Eris, do me a favor,
she pleaded with the young woman. Eris looked at her.
I have a bar called Seventh Heaven in this neighborhood. There's a little girl named Marlene there.
Eris nodded, understanding.
Don't worry,
she assured the woman.
I'll put her somewhere safe.
A relieved smile spread across Tifa's face and she clutched tightly onto Eris's hand in a firm, friendly grip. Eris smiled back at her, a smile filled with confidence and self-assurance. She slipped the ball of ice materia into Tifa's hands, feeling she would need it. Tifa then released the girl's hand and quickly turned to the spectators standing around her.
It's dangerous here,
she shouted to everyone so they could hear her.
Everyone get away from the pillar, quickly. Everyone get out of Sector 7.
For a moment or two the people around her just stared blankly as they comprehended what Tifa was trying to say. The words hit home just a few seconds later and the people scattered, running around in all directions in their desperation and confusion. Some people ran back into the slums, while others ran for the train station. Some people just ran back to the pillar, ready to wait for the end as they looked up at the battle raging above them. Eris just knelt back down beside Wedge, checking him over to see if he was going to be all right. Cloud and Tifa ran through the open gate and onto the stairs leading up along the side of the pillar. The metal beneath their feet was shaking as they ran, vibrating from the many bullets that were being powered into the metal above them. The control system for the pillar was at the very top, so they had no choice but to run round and round towards the top, running as fast as they could. As they ran round the first corner they came to a stop as they saw a figure lying slumped across the rail of the stairs, badly wounded from bullets that had hit him hard in his chest and stomach. Tifa cried out in dismay, for the person lying there was Biggs. Cloud ran to Wedge and carefully pulled him away from the rail, holding him carefully in his arms. Biggs was still conscious but quickly fading, trembling slightly as he looked up at Cloud's face. His own face was pale and shaking, losing the battle that he was fighting.
Cloud?
He gasped, his voice grated and sore.
So you don't care? What happens to the planet? You're wounded?
Cloud said, looking at Biggs's fatal wounds. Tifa knelt beside him and picked up Biggs's fallen bandana from the floor, beginning to tie up one of the wounds, even though it was a pointless effort. Biggs smiled a little, just as Wedge had done.
Thanks, Cloud,
he said, his voice almost a whisper as he breathed deeply with each speech.
Don't worry about me. Barrett's fighting up there. Go help him.
Cloud nodded, and carefully propped Biggs up against the rail, positioning him so he could still sit up and fight with his gun if he needed to. Tifa gently wiped Biggs's face a little, tears in her eyes to see another of her friends hurt like this. Biggs didn't say anything else and just smiled a little, before wincing in pain. Tifa eventually stood up and began to run after Cloud up the pillar, praying with all her heart that the rest of Avalanche was all right. Sadly, she did not get her wish, for further up the pillar towards the top they encountered the last minor member of Avalanche, lying wounded and abandoned on the floor. Jessie was trying her hardest to climb back to her feet, but the pain from her wounds quickly overcame her and she collapsed back onto the ground, just as Cloud and Tifa ran to her.
Cloud?
The girl whispered as she spotted Cloud kneeling beside her. She looked relieved to see him.
I'm glad I could talk with you one last time.
Cloud shook his head.
Don't say last.
Jessie lifted her head a little, but a wave of nausea and dizziness swept over her and she was forced to lie back down. As with the other Avalanche members she managed a gentle smile, a smile that revealed her courage and lack of fear.
That's all right,
she breathed softly.
Because of our actions, many people died. This probably is our punishment.
Another wave of dizziness swept over her and she passed out, falling limp in Cloud's arms. This time a tear ran down Tifa's face, unable to bear the suffering of her friends any longer. She jumped to her feet and began to charge up the last set of stairs towards the platform where the gunfire was at its loudest. Cloud waited a moment as he laid Jessie's head down onto the metal path, before he followed Tifa. They reached the top of the stairs at last, their legs burning, just in time to see the battle that was raging there. The control panel was built in the center, with 2 Shinra soldiers lying dead around it. The pillar itself was still rising past them nearby, up towards the bottom side of the pillar. Barrett was standing at the far end of the platform with his gun arm raised and pointing at the air. He ignored Tifa and Cloud at first as they ran onto the platform, for he was busy firing away at the air. He turned sharply as he heard the sound of clattering feet behind him, and pointed his gun at Tifa and Cloud. A look of relief crossed his face as he saw the two, although it only lasted for a split second before it grew stern once again.
Tifa! Cloud!
He called to them.
You came. Be careful. They're attacking from the helicopter.
Tifa nodded firmly.
Better equip ourselves before they attack in full force.
With that she grabbed the ball of green materia that Eris had given back to her, and threw it back to Barrett, who quickly slipped it home in his gun, arm materia slots. Just as he finished slotting it in, the sound of fast, spinning blades came from above them.
Here they come!
Tifa called, clenching her fists ready. The 3 looked up above them, and saw a Shinra helicopter flying towards them at a rapid speed. Barrett raised his gun arm and began to fire once more at the chopper, trying to bring it down before it got too close. His bullets struck the metal blades and frame of the helicopter but did little damage, and the helicopter swerved towards them. As the helicopter approached, a door slid open in the side. Cloud gasped in anger as he saw Reno standing in the doorway, the same Reno who had tried to capture Eris in the Sector 5 church. Reno waited for a second as the helicopter steadied itself over the platform before he jumped down towards them. As he landed, Barrett turned and began to fire at him, but Reno was swift and quick and was by the control panel in a second, his hand hovering over the controls. Barrett ran over and quickly took aim once again.
You're too late,
he sneered.
Once I push this button.
Barrett stepped forward quickly to stop Reno, but he was far too late. Reno pushed down on the large red button on the control panel, and a number of flashing lights lit up on the panel. He looked up at the group and grinned.
That's all, folks,
he announced.
Mission accomplished. We have to disarm it.
Tifa cried, turning to Barrett and Cloud.
Cloud. Barrett. Please.
Reno turned to her, a frown replacing his grin.
I can't have you do that,
he said.
No one gets in the way of Reno and the Turks.
The Turk then reached for a long black pole tied to his waist and pulled it out. It looked like just a black pole that could hardly do much damage, which seemed as quite a surprise considering Reno was supposed to be an expert assassin. As he pulled it out, he held it out in front of him, a sly smile on his face. He signaled for them to attack. Barrett fell right into the trap. He ran forward with his good arm raised to hit Reno hard and end it quickly. As he approached, Reno swiftly stepped out of the way, letting Barrett run past. Barrett skidded to a stop and turned sharply, beginning to charge at Reno again. Reno stepped aside again, but this time he raised his pole and jabbed it hard into Barrett's waist. A bright wave of white light flashed through the air and Barrett was lifted from the ground. He was thrown across the platform, and Cloud and Tifa managed to dodge just in time as Barrett sailed past them and crashed to the floor at the end of the platform, skidding across the metal before coming to a stop beside the rail. He lay stunned on the floor, staring up at the plate above him. The black rod in Reno's hand crackled intensely, while Reno smiled smugly as he turned his gaze towards Cloud and Tifa. His weapon was an electric rod, and a powerful one. Barrett slowly sat up, his body shaking slightly from the electric charges running through his body.
Shocking, isn't it?
Reno asked teasingly, twirling the rod round in his hands.
Never rush in without knowing what you're up against. That's a lesson you should not forget.
Cloud and Tifa looked over at Barrett as he stood up, still slightly dazed. A small beeping noise began to sound around them, and Reno glanced down at his watch.
It's time,
he said. He nodded his head towards them and then turned. He ran forward, brushing past Tifa harshly as he dashed for the end of the platform, where he climbed up and jumped off. As Tifa recovered from the collision, she turned and quickly ran towards the control panel, beginning to type furiously into it.
Cloud!
She shouted suddenly, turning her head sharply to Cloud.
I don't know how to stop this. Try it.
Cloud ran over to her and looked down at the console in front of him. Now that the main button had been pressed, a number of lights and switches had activated and were flashing. He stared at it, before he finally shook his head.
It's not a normal time bomb,
he said plainly. The sound of helicopter blades caught their attention, and the group looked up towards the end of the platform where Reno had jumped. The helicopter then rose up from beneath them and hovered just above the platform. The door then opened and a man stepped out and looked down at them. He was Tseng, the leader of the Turks. He was dressed in a smart blue suit like Reno was, and had a head of long black hair that had been neatly brushed back out of the way. He had a cold and callous expression that also held a sense of satisfaction as he looked at the group in front of him.
That's right,
he said to them.
You'll have a hard time disarming that one. It'll blow the second some stupid jerk touches it. Please, stop it.
Tifa pleaded desperately, her mind focused on all the people in the slums below who were still unaware of the dangers awaiting them.
Ha, ha, ha.
Tseng laughed.
Only a Shinra executive can set up and disarm the emergency plate release system. Shut your hole.
Barrett shouted angrily. He raised his gun arm and began to fire at the helicopter, attempting to knock Tseng from his perch and make him fall to his death. Tseng just looked down at Barrett, his face calm.
I wouldn't try that,
he warned Barrett sternly.
You just might make me injure our special guest.
He turned his head and looked at a small, meek figure that was kneeling shamefully on the floor beside him. Cloud and Tifa stared as the young figure raised her head and looked back at them dolefully. The two gasped.
Eris!
Tifa cried. Tseng blinked.
Oh, you know each other?
He asked, looking at Tifa and then at Eris.
How nice you could see each other one last time. You should thank me. What are you gonna do with Eris?
Cloud demanded. The Turk leader shrugged his shoulders dismissively.
I haven't decided,
he admitted. He looked at Eris again.
Our orders were to find and catch the last remaining ancient. It's taken us a long time, but now I can finally report this to the president.
Eris leaned over the edge of the helicopter and called out to them.
Tifa, don't worry. She's all right.
Angrily, Tseng grabbed Eris roughly by her shoulder and gave her a harsh slap across the side of her face. Eris fell to the floor beside him, cradling her cheek. Tifa ran to the edge of the platform and reached up for Eris desperately.
Eris.
Eris climbed to her knees and leaned over again, her cheek red and sore.
Hurry and get out.
She pleaded with them.
Ha, ha, ha.
Tseng laughed, amused by their desperate pleas.
Well, it should be starting right about now. Think you can escape in time?
The helicopter blades whirred faster and began to lift the helicopter up into the air. Tifa reached up as far as she could as it rose away from her, carrying Eris with it. The chopper reached the top of the sector and turned, beginning to fly away from them at a rapid speed. As it flew away, a small explosion occurred from within the pillar nearby. It shook violently, and large chunks of rock began to break away from the pillar and tumble down towards the sector below. The platform shook beneath their feet as small pieces of rock began to fall around them like rain. The pillar was breaking apart, and that meant that at any moment the plate would fall down.
Once that plate starts coming down it'll be too late, said Tifa. We gotta hurry.
She and Cloud looked around desperately. There was too little time for them to run back down the stairs and leave the sector. The plate would surely fall before they could even reach the bottom. Barrett looked around the perimeter of the platform, and his eyes fell on a long cable attached to the rail. It looked as though it was attached to the plate ahead of them, and seemed sturdy enough.
Yo, we can use this wire to get out,
he said. Tifa and Cloud looked over to see Barrett run to the rail, where he climbed up and unhooked the cable. He signaled for Tifa and Barrett to come over, and they did so. Tifa climbed onto the rail and held onto Barrett tightly. Cloud climbed up on the other side and held firmly onto the cable. The three looked at each other and nodded, before they jumped down and began to swing away from the pillar. The moment they left the platform the pillar exploded, shattering into a million pieces. Up on the ground above the people walking around stopped in surprise as the ground beneath their feet suddenly jerked violently, a loud creaking noise reverberating around them. At the edges where the plate joined to the rest of Midgar, the large metal hinges that helped to hold it up suddenly disconnected, and the plate tilted harshly to one side. The people on the plate screamed loudly as they fell to the side, their balance lost. Then the hinges on the other side gave away, and the plate began to topple down towards the slums below. It was only at the last moment that the people in the slums realized what was happening. Those in their houses only realized something was wrong as the newsreaders on their screens looked up in horror and screamed before their signal was lost. On the streets people looked up in horror as they saw the large dark metal plate falling towards them. They stared and then began to run, although by then it was far too late for them to escape. On the cable Cloud, Tifa, and Barrett continued to swing away from the sector. The cable jerked violently as the plate began to come down, but it remained firm as they swung towards the large doors leading out of the sector. They passed through it rapidly, just moments before the plate crashed down onto the ground behind them. The ground shook ferociously as the plate finally landed, and the sound of the crash was so loud it echoed all the way through the rest of Midgar. It was as though a meteor had suddenly hit, and clouds of smoke and pieces of metal flew through the open door leading out of the sector and tore through the park of Sector 6. The only place that did not hear the full horror of the tragedy was the Shinra HQ. At that very moment President Shinra was standing in his office looking out of the large windows at Sector 7. From where he was he could see the large gap where the plate had fallen, and could still see the plate as it crashed to the ground and large flashes of red began to rise up around it as fires broke out. He stared blankly at the devastation before him, not even a look of concern crossing his face. End of chapter.